Hello and welcome. Welcome, everyone. We have 24 participants so far. Let's get the number up. Kick off in a couple minutes here. Hello and welcome, everyone. We are thrilled to have you here for the fourth and final session of Leland's Fall College Application Bootcamp. We'll wait a couple minutes to let everyone get in. But while we're settling in, please take the time to scan the QR code on your screen. It'll take you directly to Leland's website where you can explore all the amazing coaches and programs we have to help you on your journey to getting into your dream school. Okay, couple more announcements. At the end of the bootcamp, which is today, we'll be sending out a link to a scholarship application where one lucky enrollee will get a free one-on-one coaching session with some of our top experts and coaches on our website, including our host for today, Charles. Remember, attending all the live sessions and doing the session assignments definitely gives you points towards winning. So make sure to do the one for today as well and stick around for the whole session. Also, don't forget to join our Facebook group where parents and students can connect, ask questions, and share experiences. Nick and I will be active there for any questions, offering advice, and it'll be a great way to stay in touch with your fellow enrollees post the bootcamp. Okay, so today we are excited to have Charles leading our session on college-specific essays. Now, Charles is an outstanding coach with extensive experience in guiding students through the complete college application process. You can learn more about him by checking out his profile, which I'll send in the chat. We're in great hands today. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Charles, and let's kick things off for the final session.
Awesome. Sounds great. Thanks for having me. So I guess to start off, we can kind of go over a quick agenda for today's session. I think primarily, we want to cover supplemental essays and why they're a key part of the application process. A lot of schools, will have a few supplemental essays that are very similar. Some of them are very distinct and kind of out there. So you're probably asking, what is the main difference between these different essays? Why do they matter? Why do the schools kind of differ so much? How to go about, researching the best way to respond to these different essays. And then we'll kind of go over into a few examples, looking at a few kind of common mistakes that people run into. And then from there, open it up for a general Q&A. But I want to keep this, relatively interactive. So if there are any questions that come up, feel free to reach out or directly just like put a question in the chat, and happy to kind of answer any questions as we go. So to kick off, I'm happy to give a quick introduction here. So my name is Charles Lee, born and raised Houston, Texas. I'm currently a founder based out of San Francisco, working in the restaurant tech space. But my other kind of main startup is my college admissions one, which I've been doing for around 8 years now. We've worked with students from 25 different states, 5 different countries. Out of the past 100 students I've worked with, half of them are at an Ivy League school, the other half are at a top 20 school. So I've done this for quite some time. We've worked with a few hundred students at this point. I studied finance at UT, so I basically started this when I was a senior in high school. And throughout college and post grad, I've done quite a few different roles across finance and private equity investing, tech investing, as well as I built and sold a creative agency. So a wide slew of startup experience and finance experience. So happy to chat about that one off as well. But on the college admission side, worked with a ton of students, have a lot to share today. So we'll jump into the content. I think to start, I'd be super curious to kind of just see like the overall profile of, the students today. Like, what are some schools, that you're primarily targeting, and what are some of the top schools that you're hoping to get into? If you could share in the chat, you can just share like your early decision, maybe your early action, the schools you're prioritizing, any of the ones that you're unsure about applying to, and I'll try my best to cover the breadth of them today. Awesome. So it seems like we have a pretty good range of schools so far. A few Stanfords coming up, Princeton, some Ivies, great state schools. Okay, this will be helpful in terms of how we kind of go about today's conversation. So the other part that we kind of had for the take-home assignment was getting to read through a few example essays of students that I've worked with prior. We'll cover this in a few slides. Basically, we're going to dive into some of these example essays and kind of just talk through like what these essays have done really well, and maybe a few areas that they can improve on. But all of the essays that we shared were from students who were accepted into those schools. So you get like a very, you know, clear line of sight into what good essays kind of look like, at least the ones that, have gotten students in. And I think the most important part there is like, essays are just one part of the overall application process, but they're certainly a key part in, you being able to tell your story. And that's kind of why we want to cover why supplementals matter. I see a quick question about submitting the assignments. There's no need to submit the assignments. A large part of this, again, is very much self-guided. We want you to do the assignments because it helps you better understand the content that we go over during the session, and we want to make it collaborative. So to kind of dive into, why supplementals matter, right? Like the way that I typically tell all my students to think about the college application process is that every single question and every single opportunity for you to share a little bit about yourself fundamentally answers one of two key questions. The first question is why you, and the second question is why this school. Basically, any question that you see from a prompt standpoint, whether it's any supplemental essay, the personal statement, the extracurriculars list, even the interviews that you have, going into some of these applications and all these different questions that they ask during the interview process, everything's ultimately trying to answer one of those two questions. Why should we choose you? What has made you differentiated? Why are you such a great, outstanding student? And then why have you chosen us? Right? Like, why are you looking to go to our school in specific when there's are, thousands of private schools, thousands of great public schools, all across the U.S. Everyone has, great programs. Everyone's, relatively diverse and has, all the majors that you're looking for, right? Like, why have you done all of this work throughout the past few years of your high school experience, ultimately to choose to kind of apply to our school? So a large part of the supplementals is your opportunity to have more what I like to consider real estate to kind of share your story, right? Every single opportunity where you can write about yourself and share a part of your story is effectively real estate for you to kind of build together this narrative and craft together this structure that helps you better understand, what makes you distinct, what makes you a good fit towards this overall school, and how you will contribute. So the first key thing is reflecting that fit, right? When you go look into these different schools' missions and values, how have you kind of represented yourself in a way that aligns with what the school is looking for? So some of the schools that we're going to be covering today, many of y'all have mentioned in the chat, for example, like Stanford or Harvard. Like these are very, very, two incredible schools that are incredibly complex and hard to get into. But the main question becomes, why does your application differ between applying to Stanford and applying to Harvard? And a large part of that is just understanding the school's mission and what they're optimizing for when applying for these programs. So to give kind of just like a really quick example, and I'll dive deeper into the why and kind of the example itself later. But like Stanford is very much looking for, students who are very passionate about something, who are willing to go really deep into a certain subject area, whereas Harvard is looking a lot for kind of leaders in their respective field across, many different fields. And so when you're going about your application process, you want to make sure like, hey, did I actually understand what the school is looking for when I did my research? Have I done the work to, tie together my extracurriculars and my activities into what the school is looking for? And do I have the essay that allows me to create this bridge between, the extracurriculars, all of your, activities inside, outside the school, your academics, your future interests, and basically your intention to apply to that school. And that's where I think the essays, are ultimately really important, not just the supplementals, but your personal statement, because it is your personal voice that allows you to tie everything together and becomes that bridge, which is a concept that I'll touch on quite a bit today. Um, so the second main thing is this idea of showing passion and preparedness. I think a lot of schools want to be able to see students have done the research, have dug really deep into a lot of different sources to figure out like, hey, like, is this a school that is a good fit for you? And we'll chat on very soon about how to actually go about doing research into a lot of these different programs. But a large part of it is just understanding, hey, like the school wants to know why you have chosen them. Because when writing the supplemental essays, if you're writing, let's say, why Yale or why Harvard type of essay, you can't just copy paste everything that you've done for another school and hope that it works out. even if you kind of set up placeholders, it's very easy to understand and see through an essay that didn't have much effort put into it, and it's very much a drag and drop. So showing your passion and preparedness is really important. And that's how like demonstrated interest is kind of like that phrase that a lot of people kind of refer to. It's just like, have you demonstrated your interest in applying to the school? How have you demonstrated that you are actually a good fit? The next one is, differentiating yourself. So this one's pretty obvious, but it answers the key question of why you. And a common thing that I see a lot of students do when talking about applying for different programs is they get a little bit shy. They're not, they're pretty humble. But frankly, like this is your one opportunity to really highlight all of the things that you've done over the past few years and exactly how you'll contribute to this campus community and take advantage of the school's resources. So I'm going to emphasize that last point, once again, the key thing that a lot of these schools are looking for is how are you going to take advantage of the resources that this school offers, right? Just because you're a great student, just because the school has great resources, doesn't mean that you'll necessarily leverage them in the right way. And a large part of, if you think about the psychology of how a school, views themselves as an entity, a lot of schools want to leave a legacy, right? They want to be able to have alumni that, leave the school, ultimately donate to the school, do great things in the world, and create an incredible network for them to kind of showcase to future students, right? And so a large part of, you applying to their school should be getting them excited about what the future of you looks like, right? They want to be able to see, my profile as Charles Lee, and it's like, okay, great. Like you have done XYZ activities. Maybe your activities don't tie too well into the major you apply for, but that's okay. As long as, I have written essays that explain very, very clearly and precisely, when I come to Yale or when I come to Harvard or Stanford, et cetera, here's exactly what I plan to do. Here's exactly how I plan to fit in, how I plan to contribute to community, and create an overall environment that people, really want to be a part of. And give the admissions officer a reason to believe that, hey, like you are someone who has the ability to create a really differentiated impact in the long run. And that gets people excited, right? And that's really important because the application process is very much an emotional connection between the writer and the reader. It's not, a bot that's reading your profile. It is someone else on the other side that is reading your essay who wants to get emotionally excited about your outcome, right? Like you want to be able to write an essay that someone reads and they're like, wow, like person is such a good fit. When the discussion comes up of who do we admit, this person will remember your profile and go to bat to, argue for why they want you in their school, or why you'll be a good fit. So that's kind of like the third main thing to look for. And then finally, the supplementals matter because the schools are giving you an opportunity to share about what they're prioritizing in their students. It's almost like a little hint of, what are their missions, what are their values, and that's kind of how you'll go about, understanding and interpreting some of these essay prompts. Again, which we'll have an exercise on doing on this next slide of what are you looking for to actually differentiate yourself when it comes to some of these schools. So that's like a very, very high level overview into why supplementals matter. I know I've been rambling a little bit here, but are there any questions before we kind of jump into the different types of supplemental essays? And feel free to just unmute your mic and jump in if there is anything that stands out. Okay, great. No questions. I'll take that as a positive sign. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is the different types of supplemental essays. A large part of, when you go about applying for these different schools is that there's definitely strategy that is tied into how you approach writing your essay, right? There's different types of prompts that are coming up here and there. Every school is looking for something different. So the key question becomes, how do you play this like a game of figuring out what the school is looking for, and how do you write an essay that really, contextualizes your application to this school. So a really good example of this is the difference between, let's say, like Harvard and Stanford. But before I jump in, I am kind of curious, you know, are there essay prompts that people are currently working on right now that they might be a little bit stuck on, or they're unsure on how to answer? If so, feel free to drop those in the chat and we'll definitely take some time to kind of talk through those. And we'll talk through why they fit into kind of one of these few buckets.
嗯，
Was there a question?
对，真的好热。是，
Chelsea, do you mind muting? Perfect. Okay, so let's go into some of these different buckets. The first one is like, why our school? We kind of talked this a little bit already on the previous page, but there's typically one specific prompt that is very, very obviously targeting like, hey, like, why are you choosing our school? For example, Penn has multiple essays where it's like, we want our students to create an impact, in the world or on our community. Here is a list, or here's a link to our resources. Tell us what you'll take advantage of, right? So some schools are very, very direct and just telling you, we want you to do your research and we want you to get creative in terms of how you're actually going to contribute. But they want you to do the research, right? Every school, wants themselves to feel special, and they want to know that they're going to be a good fit for your next few years. So this is your opportunity to kind of demonstrate your interests. You can highlight specific programs, resources, aspects of campus life that align with your vision of what you want your future to look like. There's, again, a lot of different ways to kind of go about the research that we'll touch on the next slide. But a large part of this is just, hey, how have you done your research? Do you even know like what the culture is like for this school? And your supplemental essays are an opportunity for you to align with what the school is looking for. So the second type of supplemental essay is why this major, or why are you applying for what you're interested in? Different schools have different ways of asking this problem. So, like, for example, let's see. I think like Stanford has a question like, what is your what is like an academic topic that gets you excited about learning, or gets you genuinely excited about learning? And I think that's like a very, very good opportunity for you maybe to share about your major. There's an argument to talk about something else outside of academics. And we'll touch on the nuances of that in a bit. But some schools are very direct where it's like, hey, for UT Austin, where I went to school, there was a topic where it's like, um, why did you select the major that you did? And how will McCombs or how will our programs contribute to you creating an impact on the 40 acres, which is the nickname for UT. And so a large part of it's like, hey, like we are asking a very, very targeted question of why are you choosing this major? And a large part of it's like, hey, like you want to share a personal story that the reader can understand, hey, there's a very clear reason why this person has chosen finance for what you want to study, or why you want to choose neuroscience, why you want to choose economics. And having the more personal approach to it is exactly how you kind of create that emotional connection, right? Because if you think back about, the overall concept of an application process, it is you sharing your narrative and your story to a school. It is someone else on the other side, a human being that is reading your essay, and they want to be able to kind of go to bat for you. And if you're able to create a very personal story or a narrative that kind of ties together your history, your past, your experiences into that specific major, that's how you ultimately are able to differentiate yourself versus someone else that just says, hey, I want to study finance because I think business is interesting, or I want to study economics because the stock market's interesting, right? It becomes a lot more fun to read if you say, hey, growing up, I traded stocks with fake money for 10 years of my life. I learned an incredible amount, and now I want to find ways to dig deeper into the theoretical side and find ways to create a tangible impact outside of class, right? And so figuring out what those little narratives are that kind of tie together your personal story is really, really important for, both answering why that school matters to you, but more specifically, why the major matters for you. Because typically, outside of, let's say, like legacy students, you probably won't have a very personal story that ties you to a single university. Whereas for, concepts and topics like majors, like, economics, neuroscience, like there is typically a reason, a very personal reason why, your past experiences have led you to kind of go down that path. Okay, I see a few questions coming up here, so let me take a quick pause and read through these before I jump into targeted prompts. So I see first question is how direct your essay should be. Uh, so when there's a lot of different essay prompts that ultimately ask you like a pretty broad question of like, okay, great, like why do you want to study finance? I personally never answer with, I want to study finance because XYZ. I think it's an incredibly boring way of essay writing. Um, in the past kind of 5, 7 years that I've really been doing this extensively, the best essays are usually a combination of narrative and synthesis. And what I mean by that is a narrative is a personal story or some aspect of storytelling. It doesn't. It should be personal. It should be something that only you can share. And the synthesis is the why behind why that story matters. And so when I see a good essay, and we'll kind of dive into a few of these in the example essay section, you'll typically see a narrative that ultimately prompts the synthesis. So it's like, hey, like I have this story of me growing up, and then you add the context around why that has led you into studying a certain major, or why that has led you to be interested in a certain field. So what do you do if your personal essay overlaps with why you want to pursue your major? That's okay. I think that, typically personal essays uh, should probably cover a little bit more than just why you want to do your major. But in the instance that it does, you should find, other stories that also tie into why that major is interesting to you. Or find creative ways to kind of go about it, where maybe there's like an alternative story that has led you to be really interested in a major. Or maybe talk about like the impact that you are really excited about with that major, and that's what gets you excited, right? So there's a lot of different things you can share about a single topic, especially if this topic is truly interesting to you, and that shouldn't, only be tied around, your personal story or a single personalized experience. Because if it is true that, let's say, my reason for studying finance is only true for one particular narrative of, hey, I used to trade stocks and that's why I'm interested, then it's probably not a great major for me to choose. There's probably some other stories that I should, do some soul searching around to figure out, why did I ultimately choose finance? So if there is overlap, you should get creative. You should kind of dig deep into understanding your own personal stories, understanding, what the school is looking for, and try to find creative ways to kind of go about it. Dev, it seems like you have a specific question about a supplemental you're working on. Feel free to just type it into the chat since I'll be going top down here. So if you want to tie your major to a supplemental, if you're not sure what major you're applying for, you're going into medicine, but not decide on major. That's okay as well. If you know what you want to study, like a general field slash topic, that's more than enough to kind of just pick a major to quote unquote apply for, right? Because when you're applying for a lot of these different schools, the major you actually select is not binding. There's no reason as to why you can't change your major, especially if it's all within the field of medicine. And so specifically for medicine, a good example of this is, hey, like you can apply for biology, biochem, you can apply for neuroscience, and ultimately all of these things will still lead you to have a degree within the medicine path. And so as long as you have one major that you think is interesting to you, and tying it together, right? And so just think through, what are the parallels and the patterns of your personal stories, and figure out, is there a major that is directionally there, right? Are there activities that you've done on your profile that directionally get you towards a certain major? And as long as your essay writing is interesting, and people get excited about what you write and why you write about it, not having a specific major is typically okay. Should you include a concluding sentence of your supplemental essays? So we'll go over some of the examples really shortly here. And the concluding essays or concluding sentences are typically hard to write actually, but there's a lot of good examples of how to do it well. So we'll jump into those in a bit here. And then finally, would you recommend doing first person narrative? So I do recommend doing first person narrative. I think it's the most impactful way of making it very personalized. I'm not sure what other ideas you might have in terms of how you approach a very personal story. But if you look at the example essays, typically I would recommend folks to use I or the first person, because it makes it very, very direct that this is someone that, has put in a lot of effort to kind of thinking through the stories. There's a very direct personal connection between why you are writing this essay, and the connection that it has to your background. So I do recommend using that first person perspective. And then finally, okay, so two more questions here. This one's a long one, so give me a quick second to read through. Okay, so if you have two prompts that effectively overlap, right? Like one of them asks you why this major, and another asks you why about this, like why do you want to join this program? Of course, there's going to be, innately overlap in terms of your response, right? And in this sense, I think there's a few things you can do. For the why major, you should really dig into your personal story of why this major specifically is interesting to you, right? And so if it's neuroscience, right, I want to know your personal story for why neuroscience matters to you, right? And that is a very, very different question and a very different answer than if you were to answer the question of why are you interested in this program, right? Because the program typically consists of many other things than just classes on this topic, and specifically not just neuroscience, right? And so if you were to ask me, hey, like, why do you want to do finance? And then why do you want to do the business honors program? Those are fundamentally very different things. I don't even have to talk about finance at all in why you want to do a program. And the example behind that is like, hey, why do I want to do, like, let's say the business honors program, or why do I want to do the scholarship program? Well, great. It's a combination of a few different things. It's the people that, you ultimately surround yourself with. It's the resources and the programs that, ultimately exist within, this overarching scholarship program. It's all of the curriculum that, is really interesting, but helps you expand outside of just your personal interest in neuroscience, or, in a business sense, my interest in finance, right? And so there's a lot of different ways to kind of think about what these majors and what these programs offer you outside of just the context of, hey, I'm interested in applying for finance, I'm interested in applying for neuroscience. Let me just answer the same thing for why I want to do the honors program. You can get creative. There's not really a clear rule for what you can or can't do here, as long as it answers the question from the reader's perspective, right? And I think a really good way to practice that is share essays with friends, with family, and see if it answers the question. Cool. So the next question here is having a hook about a cultural experience through a book. I think that's fine, right? Like if this is a book that, has a personal connection to you and is something that stands out to you, explain why it's personal to you, right? I think the most important thing is that when you're writing supplemental essays, you want to have a response that no one else can submit, right? You don't want to just say, oh, like, I played a sport when growing up. I had an injury. I overcame it, and now I really want to do sports management. Uh, you can probably have thousands of essays that look identical to that every single year. Whereas if you say, hey, like, you know, growing up, I spent hours and hours watching sports. And then from there, I started finding ways to get even deeper into it. I started doing research around sports analytics. I started running my own personal blog, writing about different sports matches and kind of diving into different player experiences. I started reading different biographies of different players and why they were inspiring. The deeper you go into your personalized story of why you're choosing a major or why you're choosing a school, is ultimately how you can write an essay that no one else can submit. Uh, Very frankly, because no one else has had that same lived experience as you have. So that's typically the most unique way to kind of go about having a hook. It's typically, tying together that personalized experience. So I see something here about, making the most of your honors and activities. If they're about community service, but you want to take STEM majors in colleges, I don't think those are conflicting at all, right? Like, you just need to explain why you want to take STEM, right? Or why do you want to take or study a certain major, even if you don't have those activities within, your profile, right? You can say, hey, like, throughout my high school, like, a value or a, yeah, something that you really valued was community service, but that has nothing to do necessarily with the fact that you don't want to do STEM, right? So as long as you have a really good reason for why you want to do STEM, it's okay if everything else in your profile is around music, right? You can share the reason of why you chose to do music and now why you want to do STEM, right? Just answer the question. It's that's typically the best bet, even if there's no kind of connection points. But try your best to find a connection point. Maybe one of your volunteering activities led you to have exposure into a scientific field or into a STEM field, and that got you excited. So for exchange programs, let's see. You can again. I think a lot of these questions are like, can I write about X, Y, Z? Typically the answer is yes, right? As long as you have a reason why, and that reason should typically be personalized to you. If the word count is short in a why us essay, do you focus more on the school or what you'll offer in your interest? Typically, if it's a why us essay and us in the context of like, why are you choosing this school? You definitely want to lean much more into the school itself. So in the example supplemental essays, I believe essay E is a Why Columbia essay, that's 200 words. Um, and you'll see exactly how you kind of balance together, really focusing on the school throughout the entire essay, but making it very narrative driven, and almost like putting yourself into the reader's perspective of what the student's life will look like, once they're at that school. So there's different ways to kind of go about it. I'll share a link here in the chat just for folks to have reference for these essay examples. But again, like even if you have a 200 words or so, typically kind of just focusing on the school itself is pretty important. Emily, in terms of what type of aspects of school we should show, it depends on what matters to you, right? We'll jump into researching the schools on the next slide, and I'll touch on that soon. I'll answer like one or two more questions here, and then we'll continue with the slides. So what are the most important factors in essay to call the attention of the reader? That's a good question. I think like having a personalized story is what gets people's attention, right? If I share a really interesting story about my background and why that has led me down a certain path, that is a lot more interesting than just jumping straight into why I think finance is interesting. And again, I'm using finance as an example since that's what I studied. But frankly, it doesn't really matter what I say, right? I can say any major, and the idea is still there. I could choose to talk about anything I want, but the way that you actually get it to be enticing is the way you write the essay, not necessarily as much around the content. Okay, let's finish this slide and then we'll jump into the remaining questions slash answer some of the other questions because I've seen some questions about research that's on the next slide. So let's just finish up this page really quickly. The final type of supplemental essay are going to be targeted prompts. These are ones where schools are looking for a specific answer around your response in a situation around leadership, community, teamwork. These kind of gauge your personality, they gauge your creativity, but these are the exact prompts that showcase, hey, this school is really looking for leadership, or this school is really looking for community. Uh, these are basically answers to the test, right? When you're taking a test in high school, one thing that I usually did was like, you're taking the test, you have a hard question, you don't really know the answer, and then you read further down into page 3, page 4 of the test, and then one of the questions kind of was like, oh, like this semi answers a previous question. That's basically what prompts are, right? Like they are giving you a perspective into, hey, like these are the questions that I am asking as a school. This is probably something that I care about, right? And so if a school is asking about leadership, you probably want to think about, responding from a sense of, hey, I am, someone who can be a leader in the context of all your other essays as well, right? Unless it's like, hey, okay, great. Like we have one essay that's about like, why this school. You probably shouldn't be like, oh, okay, like I'm going to be a great leader at the school because blah, blah, blah. That one should probably be more around, hey, like why you want to do this school. But if the question is more around, hey, like why you specifically, one of those two main questions that we talked about, one of those two key questions, that's a really good opportunity for you to talk about leadership, especially if you see that another prompt as giving you the opportunity to kind of give you a glimpse into what they prioritize. And it's like, hey, leadership matters to us. That is something that we care about. And so for a really quick example, before we jump into the next slide, is the difference between Harvard and Stanford essays is a really good way to demonstrate this in practice. So Harvard, as I mentioned previously, cares a lot about leadership. Their prompt this year, one of the prompts is Describe a time when you strongly disagreed with someone about an idea or an issue. How did you communicate or engage with this person? What did you learn from this experience? This is like screaming to you that Harvard cares about leadership. They care about how you react in situations where there's conflict and how you respond in conflict. That is very much a trait or a quality that, you know, a leader demonstrates effectively, and that's what that's what the school looks for. Whereas Stanford, on the other side, has a few questions that are very much in a different realm. What is the most significant challenge that society faces today? How did you spend your last 2 summers? Reflect on an idea or experience that makes you genuinely excited about learning. These are all very much about like, hey, how do you spend your time and what do you care about, right? That is not very much like, that's not as much around a question of leadership, but it's more so a question of like, what are your passions, right? Like what gets you excited about, living life? What gets you excited about the world? And that's why, for me personally, when I just think about the different students I've gone into some of these schools, uh, your profile typically matches, your school you usually get into, right? The leaders that I've worked with, or the student leaders from different clubs, different organizations, typically go to Harvard. And the students that are really good at like one or two things and have spent, their entire life at it, typically get into Stanford. And that's not coincidental. Especially when you have a sample size of a few hundred students, you can typically start seeing a lot of these patterns. And I can guarantee you that, a lot of these questions are very much targeted. Okay, let's see. Yeah, it seems like a few of y'all have questions here. Um, Aditya, I see you shared a few prompts here, like how the life experiences that shape who you are today enable you to contribute to our college. Again, that's very much a question of, why you, why this school. Describe a time you disagreed with on an idea. How did you engage? Again, that's very much a question about leadership. How do you resolve conflict? Um, and the thing is, like, there's I wouldn't say there's anything that would be controversial for these. Like you should, share something that is true, right? Share a story of something that you have actually faced before, and that's typically the best bet in terms of how you actually go about responding to a prompt. It's like, hey, like this was a personal experience that I went through, and just be mature about your response, right? It shouldn't be an emotional response. If it's an emotional response, then it's probably not a good response to the prompt. But you should talk through very objectively. Hey, like here are the things that I faced, and here's how I think they contribute to my future at the school. Cool. Let's talk about research because there's been a few questions in the chat about research. Researching schools. There's many, many different ways you can go about this. I guess in the chat, curious to hear, like, are there any creative ways that people have gone about, learning about their schools or learning about schools they want to apply for? While people share, I think kind of like the few generic high-level ways. Of course, just reach out to people, right? Have conversations with students, alumni, admission staff. Like reach out to like different people's emails and try to see, what their experiences are like. A really good way of doing this is just go to LinkedIn. Create a profile, find alumni from your high school maybe that have gone to a university you care about. Find if there isn't anyone, go to their alumni and search for someone from your city, from your state. And you can share like, hey, like I'm Charles from Texas. I come from a really small school. No one has really gone to Stanford before, but I saw your profile. I'm also a fellow Texan. Can I learn a little bit about your experience at Stanford? For me, as a student, I probably would respond to that. I'd be like, oh, like this person has written a really intentional response, a really well crafted question to ask about, my alma mater. I probably would respond. I'd be like, oh, great, like this person seems like they really care about learning about the school, and I want someone that is really intentional to go to my school. So reach out to folks, and I think that's like the best way to kind of understand. Um, a little bit more about that school. And that kind of begs the question of like, how do you know that the university we choose is the right one? I think that's a really good question. A large part of that is like the more people you talk to, you frankly just understand, hey, like, do you vibe with the people that you talk to? Do you vibe with the culture that like the school shares? Do you care about the mission? Do you care about the values? Does it seem interesting to you? Do you like the city that it's in, right? Do you like the weather that the city is in as well? There's no true answer for what the quote unquote best fit is. A large part of it really just comes down to your gut decision, right? And sometimes, your decision might not make sense to other people, but you should trust yourself. And I think a really clear way of doing this is I actually had a really in-depth conversation with a friend a few years ago, where one of my students, who now is a really good friend of mine, they got into Texas A&M and they got into Yale. And for the longest time, they were like, hey, like, I think I should go to Yale. And immediately, red flags kind of go off because, for me, it's like, okay, great. Like you got into a great school and you got into your safety school. Why do you only think you should go to the top school you applied for, right? Like that should almost be like, if we're sure, especially if that was like one of the schools that we talked about for a long time, of, you really wanted prioritizing Yale for kind of like one of your early decisions. It wasn't binding, so it was more so an option, but the hesitation led me to kind of like pry a little bit deeper, and it turns out that the financial reason was a large part of it, right? And as an in-state student to A&M, it would be much, much cheaper. And so for someone like him who wanted to go to medical school afterwards, it's very expensive to go to an undergrad program and a postgrad program all at a private university. So for him, it was a very good fit to go to A&M. He had a lot of AP credits that let him, effectively skip a full year of school. And it was just like a very flexible program for his profile. So in that instance, that was a really good fit for him because he had a lot of friends going to school. He really likes the city that it's in, College Station. Even though Yale had the prestige, that wasn't enough to get him over the fence of, saving a little bit of money, having a really good time in undergrad, and knowing that you can apply for really great medical programs a few years down the line. So finding like, a good fit program is very much just based on your research. And so a few other ways of doing that research is like, hey, attend the info sessions. Universities typically go to different schools or go to regional events, to online resources. YouTube is a funny kind of interesting one to do, where it's like, hey, like look at those day in life videos of a student, right? Look at what their student life looks like. Do you like their campus? Does it look pretty? My little brother is applying for college this year as well, and it's like he is not applying for U Chicago or Northwestern because Chicago is very, very cold. And we're from Texas, so we can't handle the cold. He's applying for some other schools because he really likes the campus. And frankly, like that's a good enough reason, right? Like you want to go to school where you'll ultimately be happy, and think you'll do your best work. So that's my best response for how you pick a school that's ultimately the right one. And I think it's most important that like, hey, like doing college visits is obviously a great way to understand your fit. I am personally in the boat of not doing a college visit until you get into a school, uh, until you get into all the schools that you have and see what options you have, right? Because why would you want to get attached to a school before you get in? That is typically a recipe for failure. So I typically recommend people doing the visits, once you get into the schools, see what options you have, and then actually going to the school is a great way to kind of learn a little bit more about, is this the right fit? So a few other kind of ultimate ways to go about doing your research: follow the school social media, read the news. The student newspapers also like pretty good usually. Dive deep into programs, see, what impact the different programs have made over the past few years. Are there campus initiatives that stand out to you? Are there things that, that show you patterns about how the school operates that get you excited about, that university? I think that's the most important thing to prioritize. Cool. So I'm taking a look through the messages. In Dev, it seems like you had success in reaching out to a student who helped you reach out, or who helped you apply, or effectively help you through the entire process, right? And I think like that's a really good example where like it's asymmetric upside to reach out to folks. And what I mean by that is that your downside is very, very limited. Your downside is effectively you don't get a response, but the upside is that you might have someone that really cares about your success and really puts in the effort to share you perspectives that help you apply for a school. And so I'm always a big fan of reaching out to alumni. Obviously, when you're reaching out to, let's say, like, professors or admission staff, don't email every single person. They obviously go to work together. They will share with each other, oh, did you get this message from this kid? Oh, I did. And then some other teacher chimes in, it's like, oh, like I got this message as well. And it's pretty awkward. Um, that's happened a lot, in the workforce, when I was working in finance, when, you have someone reaching out to every single employee, and we can all see each other's inboxes because we share it. So don't do that. But otherwise, reaching out to a few folks, writing targeted emails, uh, customize them to the person that's receiving it, and typically you'll get a good response. Do I believe one should go to a college visit to know if they should apply there or not? I think no, unless you know you live nearby or it's very accessible. I don't think you should go out of your way to kind of go visit school before you get in. I think that like you can probably get enough data from just doing your research, and if you're really unsure, why not just apply, right? Like you can't guarantee that you'll get in. And if you do, then great, like then go visit and see if it's an option you want to consider. But personally, it's like, hey, like if I go visit Penn and I fall in love with Penn and I talk about, why I did my visit and I fell in love with Penn in my essay and I spend my nights dreaming about going to Penn and I don't get in, and it's like, okay, great, like why did I do it in the first place? So I'm against it. But I don't know your financial situation. I don't know how easy it is for you to go visit the school you want to go see. Uh, so that is very much a personal decision. But that is my opinion, and it has worked for the students I've worked with. Cool. Let's jump into some supplemental essays. I guess like in the chat, would love to see and hear if folks have like any particular perspectives about things they really liked on these example essays. For the folks who did read them. Again, I'll share the link again here, and I'll change my screen share. I will find the essays to kind of go over here. Cool. So there's like a few essays that we can kind of talk through pretty quickly. We're running close to the end of today's session, so I won't spend too much time on this page here. But I'll just touch on a few things that I like about each of these essays. And so for the first one, the question for Penn is like talk about your intellectual and academic interests. This is very much a combination of why you and why this school. You should absolutely be able to capture this just based on the prompt. I probably should have brought the full prompt in, so that's my bad for not. But the prompt is basically, hey, like, please share us about your interests, talk through why they're interesting to you. And if it's 450 words, typically it's a great opportunity for you to share about, why this major or why this academic interest really ties into that school. And so I think, for this essay, what I really love is the first paragraph. Out of 450 words, they use around 120 to really just touch on this personal story that's like really interesting and just intriguing to read, right? You read this first paragraph, it's a first person narrative, and it's fun, right? This is someone's very personal story of why they got into engineering. And as a result, as the reader, it's like, okay, great, this is a fun essay. This shares something that's very personal to you. It humanizes the applicant. Um, and then that's really important, right? You want people to believe that, it is a student that's on the other side. It's not a robot. It's not ChatGPT. This is a story that, ChatGPT cannot output. And that's really important. It is a story that no one else can submit either. Because when you throw everything to ChatGPT, everyone's going to have a very similar output. Whereas here, you have an essay that is very personalized to you, and it's something that allows you to kind of share a story that is meaningful to you. And so, again, that's not a reason why you shouldn't use ChatGPT. I think it's helpful to help you better understand how to write good essays, and you can input your essay once you write it, and then get very customized responses in terms of how to improve it. But I think that writing a personal narrative is something that is by definition personal, and I think this is a good first example of that. So for the next two here, let's see. Oh, sorry, there was actually one more comment I wanted to make here on the previous essay. So someone mentioned about the final sentences. I think this one is a really good example of a final sentence that shows, um, a very clean way to close out the essay that ties together into your personal narrative from the very start, a long overdue upgrade, right? That is very, very similar to the overall idea of him upgrading his computer at the very top. And so that's like a fun way to close it off. That's typically a good closer because it ties into the narrative. You don't want to just say, as a result, I would like to go to UPenn, and this is why I'm interested in engineering. That is quite boring, and it leaves a weird taste in someone's mouth once they read it, especially after write a good essay, because they're like, why did you not put in the effort to write a good conclusion sentence? And overall, I think like once you read through this example, you'll see that there's just a lot of effort that was shown um, in writing the essay to just make people realize that, hey, this person has done their research. So this next essay, I think, is slightly different. It's why this school. It's 400 words for why Caltech, and I think this one does also a very, very good job of kind of mixing together the narrative and the synthesis. So it's a very sharp introduction that is like really intriguing and immediately jumps into kind of like the synthesis itself of like providing context on where this student grew up, right? And so the first paragraph is really, really short out of the total 400 words, not using much quote unquote real estate, but jumping into, this idea that, hey, like grew up, here's my background, right? Like here is how I grew up, here's the world that I lived in. Here's why you should care. Because very quickly after he goes through this kind of first paragraph, it highlights why, they view Caltech as very much a parallel to how they grew up. And I think those are the really powerful moments in an essay where you see someone's personal background and they tie it really deeply into, why there's a very clear reason why this school is a perfect fit for them. And I think this is just like a really good example of that. Because typically, it's not very easy to just copy paste this essay and submit it elsewhere, especially because not every school is a small school. Not every school is a relatively small student body. And so copy pasting something like this actually just like wouldn't make any sense. So this essay is very good because it's very concise, it's very personalized, and it shares a lot about, themselves growing up. For the why Yale essay, one thing that really stands out to me in this one, especially for a very short essay, is that every single word has like color to it. And there's very little filler space that, doesn't contribute to the overall answer. And what I mean by that is like every single word here contributes to the thesis of the paragraph, which is, why do you want to choose Yale? And it pushes the story forward, right? There's nothing here that you can actually remove um, to make the story more intriguing. Whereas sometimes you'll have students that are like talking in circles and you read things that don't really help you. So I think this is a really good instance of it where it's like, hey, like every single sentence here has shown significant research and extreme effort towards making it very clear why this profile like fits really well into a student's profile. So I think that's basically the kind of the main essays that I want to talk through. These are other two why school essays that I think just did a really good job. Let's see, a quick question around recycling essays. What would you say you could recycle depending on prompts, especially if they're applying to many schools? Your experiences stay the same. Yeah, so I think that like your narrative can absolutely stay the same, but it's challenging when your narrative is really pertaining to like a specific aspect you want to talk about, right? And so like for this essay right here, it is very, very clear that this was very much personalized to Caltech, and it makes sense. Like this was an early decision, and so it says like, hey, like despite these circumstances, I feel this growing distance between you and your extended family. Maybe you can put in I know X school will help me shorten that distance, right? Maybe some other school will help me shorten the distance. The answer becomes why, right? Like, can you do the research that makes it very, very clear that like that essay is written for that school? It's typically hard, right? Because like, how do you answer this question for like a really, really large state school? You know, I do believe that you can find excuses to write about anything and to find a tying point that makes everything connect really well together. I don't think that's a guarantee that it's a great essay, but I do think the more you're able to, reduce the chain of logic that goes from step one to step two. For example, the chain of logic that goes like, oh, like I want to go to a small school because I grew up in a very very close-knit family, right? That makes a lot of sense. But if it's like, hey, like I want to go to a small school because I grew up, I was raised in a really large family, and as a result of living in a large family, I got really tired of it. And because I got really tired of it, then I want to try the opposite. Like that's kind of just like a reach. At that point, you should probably find another reason to apply to that school, or just like another reason why like that school stands out for the supplemental. So yeah, for why Duke, why Columbia, these are just two good essays. Nothing I really want to touch on. Take a look at the final sentences. I think they do a great job of talking, just like encapsulating the overall idea that the student wants to get across. So I think that is a good point for us to kind of go back to the presentation if there aren't any other questions on the supplemental essays. Cool. So this is the final slide of content before we kind of get into the open Q&A. Um, I just want to share a little bit more about the general mistakes that I see people kind of making typically. And then we can kind of open it up for broader discussion. But basically, the key thing about your essays is that you should just read it out loud and imagine your essay from the perspective of an admissions officer, right? If a stranger reads your essay, are they going to be like, oh, wow, this was a really good essay. This, gets you excited about going to a school. It's a great story. This is a student that's going to be really successful here, right? Like, just imagine your friend sent you your own essay. What feedback are you going to give them? Are you going to say, oh, this is great? Or are you going to be like, oh, like, this is like super good. Like, this like really stood out. And with a lot of the example essays that I shared previously, like your initial read, you're probably like, okay, I get it. I understand why this student got in, right? And typically you want to have that same reaction to your own essays. Otherwise, it probably falls into one of these common mistakes. And the other kind of tip here, in order to kind of avoid some of these other mistakes, versus kind of just me just reading through the five, I think a large part of writing an essay is imagining that you're not just applying to a school, right? Imagine you're actually just storytelling and just sharing fun stories that just so happen to have a prompt around it and just so happen to be about a school, right? Find stories that are fun to tell about your background, about your upbringing, about your siblings, your passions, your interests, what do you do for fun, right? Like be very authentic. And I think that having authenticity in terms of the things that you're passionate about and the things you want to talk about ultimately help you, stand out from your story here. So if you have an anecdote from your personal life, what aspects should I pay attention to when I'm telling it? Example, family, religion, what are the unnecessary aspects in the essays? I think that's the narrative that you ultimately choose should be the narrative that allows you to tie it into the synthesis, right? And so if you go back to the Caltech prompt, it's like, hey, like why Caltech, right? Okay, well, the personal narrative I'm going to choose is about something around my culture and why like, my culture matters a lot to me, and why I want to have a close relationship with my culture. And as a result, the student shares a story about why culture is really important. They share about their upbringing and their context, and immediately transitions it into why Caltech upholds and supports him diving deeper into the culture. And I think that's like a really, really good example of understanding what to prioritize because the story that you choose supports everything else you want to write, right? Like it wouldn't make any sense for the student to be like, hey, like I want to write about, me growing up with my dog because it's really personal to me. Uh, my dog was a large part of my life. And as a result, I really want to go to Penn and study finance, right? Like that makes no sense at all. So let's say, for example, you want to talk about religion, you want to talk about your family, right? Like find the reasons why that matters to the reader. You can talk about anything you want, but why does it matter? Is not something that everything can have an answer to. And so if you understand why it matters and you're able to connect it, then there you go. Like that story has that personal aspect that really ties into, this idea of having good connectivity with the reader. They understand why it's authentic to you. And most importantly, it is a story that other folks can submit as well. And that's really, really important, right? You don't want to write an essay that other people can basically just copy paste. Otherwise, it is way too generic. It doesn't have a personal fit, and it's probably just not a good essay. So instead of reading through again some of these, I guess like the main thing is like just make sure you're directionally in line with the prompt. You don't have to answer every single part of it. Just stay focused, write about something that matters to you. Let's see. Which abilities or characteristics we should develop to make a correct essay? About being introspective person, learn about storytelling abilities, etc. Joshua, I'm not fully sure I understand this question. Do you want to unmute and kind of provide more context to your question here? I just to yeah, go ahead if you want to unmute.
Yes, like for example, to make a good essay, we need to know about ourselves. That's why it tells about the storytelling. But also, we have to share. I don't remember correctly the word, but to show that we are prepared. The school is where we are. We are what the school is looking for.
Hmm.
And that's why I talk about the storytelling, for example, to say that you make this, but how do you explain that the thing that you do is something outstanding? Kind of. I don't know if
Yeah,
we
that makes sense.
explain correctly. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, right? So when you have a prompt that is pretty open-ended, you don't have to talk about every component and aspect of yourself that you want to stand out about, plus every single person's story, plus connecting it all together, right? Like, especially if some of these essays only have a few hundred words, uh, you want to focus on the things that matter most to you. And so, for example, if you have like a quality trait that is really important to you that you want to highlight, that could be the emphasis of the story, right? Pick a narrative that allows you to kind of dive deeper into that aspect about your profile that really demonstrates your leadership or really demonstrates your community aspect. And there are ways to kind of tie that into your story from a personal standpoint, where it's like, hey, like, let's say community service matters a lot to you. There's probably some story in there about maybe you grew up and you did community service with your parents, or maybe you did it with your siblings, and it was like a very memorable kind of experience that you had. And that's like a beautiful story, right? Tying it in with something that, is very much direct to you, allows you to kind of have that connection, plus mention a trait that a school is looking for that you demonstrate very well. So I have another question here in my direct message. Let's see. So this is question around, there's two rounds to the application process, and how do you know if you'll pass the first round? Frankly, like my take on a large part of like, things that you hear is that it just doesn't really matter. Uh, right? Like the question is like how do you stand out in this quote unquote first round of application review? Uh, Frankly, like you can't do anything, right? Like you can't control how people respond to your essay. You can't control about how people react to your story. The only thing that is within your control it's just like writing good essays and just like writing something that stands out, right? Like there's no secret formula to be like, oh, like you can write about XYZ, and all of a sudden your essay is going to be looked at first, right? Your essay is very much going to be one of tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of essays that are out there being submitted every year. There's no hack, right? Just write good essays. Make your stories intriguing, make them fun to read. Um, if you don't match an Ivy League school standards, um, there's nothing you can do to hack your way into it, right? There's no cheat code. And so the only thing that I think you can really control here is just can you write good essays? Can you stand out? Can you tie them into your personal story? And does the school ultimately care about it? That's your job, right? There's nothing you can do to kind of get past that. So about the honor section, if you are an international student, Does any state award count / make a lasting impact or only national international part? Um, I'll answer this in two parts. One, I would argue that the honors and awards section is the least important part of the entire application process, just given there's no description to it. It's just an award, right? Like I've had students that just leave the award section blank because like you should mention it elsewhere if it's like really that important. Um, but I would say like, hey, like just put all the best awards that you have. Um, think about the ones that are most meaningful to you and are most impactful to you. That is probably the award or activity that you should be putting in that list. It's not a trick to put in something that you think might or might not be the case. It's typically the most impressive activities that you want to write about are going to be the ones that kind of go on that list there. So a few questions here. So if someone didn't really understand my essay fully because it's very school specific, should I change it? Um, I guess like Dev, like can you unmute and kind of talk about like what do you mean like someone didn't really understand it? Are you saying like you shared it for a friend and like they didn't understand your essay? Um, typically like if it's school specific, school specific folks are going to understand. So I don't view that as like a large issue. Like for example, if you talk about like super niche trends or traditions, if the AO doesn't understand it, they'll probably do their own research and kind of just like better understand it themselves. But you don't want to go so niche that like it's not a real trend or a tradition. And like people are just going to be like, okay, you clearly just like went as deep as you could on Google to just to find the most niche thing. That's probably not the best route. You want to go specific in the sense like you find interesting classes that stand out to you, but definitely not specific in the sense of like you've seen one person talk about this years ago, and that's where you're gonna put your hat on. Okay. So the threshold is talking about the first round being like your GPA, your standardized testing, second round being SEs and extracurriculars. Um, I don't think okay, so this is like my personal take. I don't think your GPA / SAT are something that you should, not that you don't care about it, obviously it's very important, but I would argue those are the least prioritized in terms of what actually differentiates you, right? Again, you can't control whether or not your GPA or SAT score passes a minimum threshold. There's no such thing. I've had a student a few years ago who had like a 1400 SAT, was like top 20% of the class, get into Stanford and Harvard. And on face value, the student's profile was very much, just a normal student. Like they were middle class, Asian American male. They had pretty strong extracurriculars. They applied for economics and art history. They just wrote really good essays, and frankly, like that's what I believe got them into the schools. They wrote really good essays, had great extracurriculars that reflected it. And so even if like their SAT and like SAT score and their GPA doesn't necessarily fit within that 50 percentile for the top schools, everything else stood out enough to make the student differentiated. And I think like that's the main thing here, where it's like you want to be able to submit an application that allows people to view like, okay, this person is really differentiated and has the ability to do really good things in this world. And that's how you really differentiate yourself for top schools. Otherwise, it's like, hey, like, the student has done a lot of work, done a lot of effort, and really understands why applying to our school is a really, really good fit. So that's very frankly, the best way to approach it. There's no hack for like, oh, you need to be in a certain benchmark. I've had students with really low GPA, SAT, etc., to get into really good schools. And again, like there's literally thousands of students that have perfect scores on the test every single year. It's not going to make or break your application. I think that essays matter much, much more. Another question I got was like, is it better to apply early decision, early action, or regular decision? Just apply for the schools you want to apply to. If they have early, great, apply for it. If you know that it's a school you will go to for sure, apply early decision. If you're unsure, apply early action. Otherwise, you apply regular decision. There's no trick to it. Apply for the schools you want to apply for, and if you have the options to submit early, great, go for it. Cool. So that's basically it. That's general open Q&A. Happy to answer any other questions that folks have. Feel free to reach out. Also, feel free to click on my coaching profile. I don't actually have it readily available right now. I can see if I can pull it up. And in the meantime, if anyone has questions, feel free to ask it in the chat. Any advantage applying in a round in particular? Of course, the earlier apply, the less competition you have. There are less people applying for early than there are for regular, mathematically, because you only pick 1 or 2 schools for early, and then everyone applies for like 10 schools or so for regular. So definitely have an advantage to submit early. Perfect. There's my coaching profile. So feel free to book a session, find some time. Always happy to chat through different things. I might need to change the timing on there because it says I'm available at 6 a.m. Pacific time, which it can be if that's the only time that works for you, but ideally not. So let's see. Is it a disadvantage to apply UPenn test optional? I think the goal is to provide more data points if you can. If the SAT score / ACT score is like particularly low, then you probably should go test optional if you think that the extracurriculars and everything else can supplement it well. And then the essays are just like your best bet there. Test optional for 50 percentile. I think that's generally true, but again, like, I think for top 20 ranked schools, anything above like a 1450 is probably good to submit. Probably above 1400, it's good to submit if your GPA is good. It's kind of like a teetering scale, right? For SAT and ACT. If you have a really good SAT, your GPA doesn't matter as much. If you have a really good GPA, your SAT doesn't matter as much. Those are the balancing things because it's all within the bucket of academics and none of it's differentiating. If you're planning to major in poli-sci, is it B and AP stats a red flag? I don't really know how to answer that question. Your entire profile is very, very contextual. I don't see it as why be a huge red flag. Like, you're probably fine. I wouldn't overthink a single grade in a single class. Um, you can talk through why like you spent time. Like if for example you're really worried about an extracurricular or a grade, use your additional information essay to explain why you gotta be. I personally don't think it's a big deal. I don't think grades are a big deal in general. I think essays are a big deal. If you have a bad essay, you're not going to get into a school. If you have good essays, you have more shot to get into a school. And then does Columbia really only search good SAT or and good GPA, or they may more focus on EC and essays? There's no true answer to like what schools are really prioritizing. It's a black box. Even AOs who claim they've worked there before and they have worked there before, like the ECs and the essays, like it's a holistic application. If you have like a 1200 SAT or horrible GPA, sure, like maybe a top school isn't going to be the best fit for you because if you can't do well within high school, uh, why would you do well at a top school, right? Like there are certain thresholds for a reason, and I think that the harsh thing to hear is like, hey, like if you can't do well within high school academics, it's probably gonna be really, really hard to do well at a school that's very rigorous with academics, unless you intentionally just like ignored all the school and you had like incredible extracurriculars, then great, you can explain it away. But otherwise, like there are certain thresholds for a reason, like that's typically where students perform well. Okay, so we're up on time. Really appreciate everyone listening to our session. Again, feel free to reach out. I have one final question here. I did pay work for a few months. Is that useful for an application? Yeah, if it's an extracurricular, throw it in there. Uh, there's no like great yes or no answer. So it seems like there's a lot of personal questions, like DM questions coming in. It'll be hard for me to respond to all of these like through chat right now. So feel free to book a session or reach out to my email and we can kind of schedule time. Ideally, you book through this Leland platform since everything's on there. It makes it easy for me to manage my schedule. So if you can book a session there, happy to chat. And yeah, thank you for having me. Uh, is there anything else you wanted to cover in the end of the session closing remarks?
Yeah, I got that. Alrighty, that was an amazing way to end our final session. Thank you, Charles, for that super insightful deep dive. And thank you all again for sticking around. As Charles was kind of mentioning, essays are just one of the most critical and time-consuming portions of the application. Thankfully, Charles has been incredible in helping us, you know, in guiding us through all the questions we had. He definitely answered as many questions as he could. But if you weren't able to have your question answered, or you just want to speak a little more with Charles, I recommend you to check out his profile on Leland. He's truly, one of our best. I think I just shared the link in the chat, so yeah, you can use that to schedule a free introductory call with him. And yeah, additionally, as always, I'll be sending post-session assignments shortly, but this time it will include the application link to our scholarship um, program, the one-on-one coaching session scholarship. So keep an eye out for that and definitely apply. And yeah, thank you all for taking out time in your weeks to be in this boot camp. It's been truly enlightening and engaging, and this is our final session. Nick, do you have any final remarks?
I'll just say thanks so much, everyone. It was so great to have all of you, and we wish you all the best in your college admissions journey. Thanks all.
Yeah.